as outsiders, it's very easy for us to be skeptical of American cuisine and American culture more generally. But I think you're doing a great job, Steve, of representing that culture and showing it in all its depth and the history that lies behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, what we're known for is what we've gotten very good at, and that is making food very cheap and very bad for the human body and very profitable. But there is an enormous amount of really beautiful energy in American food right now, and it's almost all coming from cultures that we would consider, from non-European cultures.
Hello, and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast. Hello, and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. This month, our guest is Steve Hoffman. Our guest is Steve Hoffman. I should know how to pronounce that given my name. Steve is from Turtle Lake in Shoreview, Minnesota, and he is the author of A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. He is also one of the Italian Wine Podcast's top 5 wine books of 2024, as selected by Tamlin Curran in the last episode of Book Club. So if you haven't already listened to that episode, I'd urge you to do so. There's some really great wine books in that selection, and Tamsin was a lot of fun to talk to. So, Steve, hi, how are you? Congratulations on being selected as one of the top 5 Italian wine books.
Thank you. I'm a little bit intimidated to be following on the heels of Tamlin Curran, the legendary Tamlin Curran, but I'll do my best to hold up my end of this.
Okay, no pressure. Before we talk about your book, I'd like to explore a bit about your background and your interest in food and wine more generally. But I understand from your biography that you are a tax preparer as well as a food writer. And I'm sure you've been asked this before, but it seems like quite an unlikely partnership. So could you tell us a bit about how you manage those two professional interests as a tax preparer and how you balance that with your work as a wine writer?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm a strange hybrid. I'm an industry of one. The reason that I'm a tax preparer is indirectly related to the fact that I studied French, English, and ancient Greek in college, which qualified me for almost no positions that would actually pay anything. So over the course of my wandering professional career, I kind of moved from first of all, being a stay-at-home dad for a while with our daughter, eventually doing some work in real estate, and then finally inheriting a tax business from my mother-in-law. So when I sort of my food writing career really began in 2012 during a trip to southern France that is the subject of this book. I kept an extensive journal. I ended up submitting some pieces that evolved from that journal to our local newspaper. Those were published and then won a National Food Writing Award in the U.S. So that it came a little bit out of nowhere. It can seem as if my food writing career came out of nowhere, but really what that was a return to my early love of books, language, literature, and the intervening years of having to do whatever I could to pay all the bills by the end of the year was in some sense an anomaly. However, in an interesting way, they really work well together. The tax preparation in the United States is very intensely seasonal. There's a very short, very intense season between about the end of January and about the end of April. And so the way that my industry is set up, I end up making really the vast majority of our family's income in the first half of the year. And that buys me a kind of freedom in the second half of the year to write extensively, to take a lot of time to write, and to write about what I love rather than simply chasing assignments that will pay. So it's an odd hybrid, but in some sense it works quite well.
And do you do Italian tax returns by chance? Or
I don't. I get asked that a lot because my clients know that I spent a lot of time abroad, but I have no interest in wading into the troubled waters of international taxation.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish that on anyone, to be fair. You mentioned this experience where you went to France in 2012, but that wasn't your first formative experience in France, was it? You had this experience as an intern when you were younger. Can you tell us something about that? Your first trip to Paris?
Yes, absolutely. I had taken French really starting in about sixth grade. So from the end of elementary school all the way through high school and into college, I had taken French. I'd been a competent French student, not really because I worked that hard at it or was particularly talented, other than I had a good accent, and that was something that I couldn't take any credit for. It was just something I seemed to be born with. Um, so I took French because I thought it was more beautiful than the German. I probably should have taken with the last name of Hoffman, and with not much more thought than that, I ended up just sort of sticking with it. But then I took the junior year off, the third year off of what was my college career, and went to Paris. Sort of had this flash insight that if I was ever going to actually speak French, I needed to go there, and I probably needed to not go on a school-sponsored trip where I would be surrounded by my classmates, American classmates who would be mostly still speaking English, even if we were in Aix-en-Provence. So I went to Paris. I spent 9 months there. I was an intern at the Little Brothers of the Poor. Their business model, for lack of a better term, was to try to relieve the loneliness of elderly people in the city. The French state more or less took care of their physical and medical needs, but there were a lot of alone, lonely, elderly people in Paris. And my job was to spend 5 afternoons a week visiting them in their apartments and just talking with them for an hour or so and then moving on to the next. So I had this, first of all, crash course in French conversation, but I also had a kind of transformation personally in that trip where I went from being this, I considered myself a not particularly interesting late adolescent or early young man from suburban Minnesota. And suddenly I was in Paris, functioning adequately as a citizen of a world capital in a foreign language. And it presented a version of myself that I just became intoxicated with. And it had me fall in love with France, both because I did fall in love with Paris as a city, but even almost more so, I fell in love with this new version of myself that I would never have believed was possible before that trip. And that really led to an entire adulthood full of francophilia. I became fascinated with Paris, with France, with French culture, French literature, and tried to get back as often as I could.
Excellent. Such an unusual internship experience to spend your internship with lonely French pensioners, but I get how that could also be completely rewarding and in some ways life changing as
It was,
well.
it was emotionally rewarding for sure. Then, as I said, additionally, it was just, it was the sink or swim version of learning a language. I had to sit there and make the best of things, and I made a hash of it for a lot of those months as I was feeling my way into the language and the subtleties of speaking it, as opposed to just knowing the rules of grammar and vocabulary. And by the time I left, I really was.
Mm.
I struggle with the word fluent, but I was speaking well and could conduct myself well in conversations on most daily topics by the time I left. And I certainly had nothing like that kind of ease when I
Yeah,
had arrived.
yeah. And I mean, I know from personal experience as well, coming and living in Italy, it can be quite easy to fall in with what we call the expat community, where you end up spending most of your time speaking English. So
Correct.
to have done an experience like yours, where you're actually meeting real French people and speaking real French,
Yep.
is such an invaluable way to go about spending your time in a foreign country.
Absolutely. And I think, if you're spending a lot of time with, people from your own country or people speaking your own language, I also think there's a certain extent to which the people in your host country know that, and so that even when you do spend time with them, there's a reluctance to let you in deeply because there's sort of an understanding that, well, you're dipping your toe into our culture, but you're not really immersed. And that was one thing that we tried really hard to do during the trip that my book is about, is as a family, we refused to have guests
Mhm.
from the United States come visit us. We wanted to be truly immersed in this village. And we also tried to kind of avoid, there's a fairly significant British expat community, obviously, in southern France. And we did our best to kind of skirt around that and avoid that so that we could be perceived as committing fully to being a part of the French culture that was surrounding us rather than going to the beach with our friends and then occasionally having conversations with French people.
Yeah, interesting. We'll come back, Steve, those lessons learned from
Mm-hmm.
the second French experience in a moment. But I want to speak a little bit about your take on American cuisine, because American cuisine, probably like British cuisine, gets a bit of a hard time sometimes. It has this, I think, as you yourself have said, this unfortunate culinary reputation from those who don't actually live there. But you won the 2019 James Beard Award for this wonderful article you wrote for Artful Living entitled "What is Northern
Mm-hmm.
Food?" So could you tell us what is Northern food and what does it mean to you? Just give us a sense of that, the culture behind the American cuisine, if you like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm surprised I'm not asked this more often. So I would say a couple of things. At first, to speak more broadly, one experience that I've had since I spent, significant time in France, what France introduced me to was a form of classicism. So what I mean by that is there is a long, deep, narrow tradition. And when you cook in that culture, you're cooking out of that tradition. And it can feel occasionally a little bit restrictive, but there is an enormous amount of reward and a surprising amount of variety when you're cooking within a single tradition based on a particular place and what that place can grow. In the United States, I feel as if rather than that sort of narrow, deep tradition, we have a broad, shallow tradition. So, and I don't mean shallow in this case necessarily pejoratively. I mean that what it means to learn to cook in the United States, because we're a nation of immigrants and because the influences on American cuisine are broad and wide geographically and culturally. What you need to learn to cook well as an American cook is actually to be able to pull influences from a variety of different cultures and culinary traditions. So what I was trying to do in this article was to revisit the food of what I consider the Great Lakes North, which is my bioregion. It's often confused with the Midwest. The Midwest of the United States is sort of the heartland, the breadbasket, the geographical center of the country. Where I'm from in Minnesota, we're much more like Canada than we are like the Midwest. And the immigrant tradition, the 19th century early immigrant tradition, was very much, Northern Europe. So Scandinavian Europe, Northern Europe, or sort of Central and Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And we can all imagine what those foods look like. It's a lot of meat, it's a lot of pork, it's a lot of cabbage, it's a lot of potatoes, it's a lot of baked goods and sweets. And I had felt that as if we sort of lazily accepted that as our cuisine, as the cuisine we were saddled with. And what I was trying to do in that article was to both accept and honor that is our tradition and there's no way to go back in time and undo that, but also understand that it's a little bit unfortunate that we restrict ourselves to that as what we think of as our food, because we have such a beautiful and dynamic um, group of cultures that have also come as immigrants just later than the European wave of immigration that happened earlier, and that too is our food. And as one example, the Twin Cities has the largest Hmong population outside of Southeast Asia. The Hmong people are the people who sort of migrated and were chased around the hills, that on the borders of Laos, China, Thailand, and Vietnam, and they have an entire way of looking at food that is really our food. They're not. It's not an external thing anymore. This is part of who we are. And I was trying to argue in that piece that it's time to broaden our definition of what our food is.
Yeah, yeah. As outsiders, it's very easy for us to be skeptical of American cuisine and American culture more generally. But I think you're doing a great job, Steve, of representing that culture and showing it in all its depth and the history that lies behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, what we're known for is what we've gotten very good at, and that is making food very cheap and very bad for the human body. and very profitable. But there is an enormous amount of really beautiful energy in American food right now, and it's almost all coming from cultures that we would consider, from non-European cultures. And there's a huge sort of web of cooking, of
Mm.
ways of approaching ingredients, of serving and sharing food that I think is should be giving us a lot of room for optimism.
Yeah, yeah. One passage from that article that I really particularly enjoyed was this hunting expedition you took, the trip where you stayed in a wooden cabin, loggers and iron miners, the Swedes, the Finlanders, and the
Yes.
Cornish, and you just conveyed the nobility of this undertaking. If I can read just a couple of lines from that, this is one of the last vestiges of the village hog killing, a harvest time coming together that acknowledges the lean months ahead and that the only way to survive a northern winter is to be part of a community. And then you continue, you talk about the heart. The heart is my favorite cut. It is tender for such a powerful muscle, and it tastes of iron and blood and survival. I really love those passages, Steve. I was almost tempted to go to the butcher's and buy a heart just to get this taste of iron and blood and survival. So yeah, I really appreciate the way that you kind of bring those cultures and that history and that culture to life in a real meaningful way.
Thank you. I'm glad. I'm so grateful you read that passage. It's one of my favorites too. I love that. I love that section of the article, and I really love that passage as well.
Mm, yeah, superb. Can we take a short reading at this point,
Absolutely.
Steve? And this is from the book that you wrote during your trip to France, a season for that, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France.
Right. This is a little bit later in the book. Just a brief introduction, the book is a story of our families immersing into this tiny winemaking village in southern France. And I end up learning a lot about wine and winemaking. I end up picking grapes and working in a local winery with two winemakers and received more or less an apprenticeship. So, this passage that I'll be reading from is a bit of a summary of what I have learned after all this time together in with these people in these vines, really spending much of my time at the production end of winemaking rather than the sipping from a glass end. So our next door neighbor is Jean-Luc, and he becomes kind of a mentor, father figure, brother, friend by the end of this book. What
Okay.
Jean-Luc mostly taught us was what he knew best: the growing and tending of wine grapes. And over our conversations, I'd come to understand how each variety of vine, not just the grapes it produced, but the vine itself, had a character. It did well in certain soils, with certain exposures to the sun, was more or less susceptible to specific illnesses, budded, flowered, and ripened earlier or later, grew upright or sprawled, had round leaves or lobed leaves, was thirsty or didn't like wind, required lots of heat, couldn't stand the damp, needed its exuberant growth to be disciplined, or needed to be encouraged to come out of its shell. There is a theory that one part of terroir is not simply the soil, but the fact that the sun releases volatile aromatic compounds from summer vegetation, and that the waxy skins of grapes are capable of attracting and holding those molecules, which contribute in aggregate, and however minutely, to the eventual flavor of the resulting wine. In the case of the Languedoc and Fougères, this would be the scent given off by the garrigue, the wild scrublands surrounding most of the vineyards in the region. It's a scent that anyone would recognize who spent a late summer day in the Midi wandering the prickly edge of a vineyard. If wine is a human body, then tannin, alcohol, and acid are the skeleton, the bones that hold it up and let it grow old without collapsing. Syrah might be said to be big boned, and Mourvedre and Carignan more bird like. Fruit and texture are like the flesh on the bones, and Grenache and Mourvedre are particularly voluptuous, while Syrah is maybe a little more muscled. An aroma is like the skin, the point of first contact, with hints and promises that can only be fulfilled once you engage with the body. Sometimes the whole ends up beautiful, and sometimes it's awkwardly limbed and ill proportioned, and sometimes, when it is beautiful, it is also something else: charming, or stern, or shy, or generous, or vivacious, or exuberant. Sometimes it has a personality.
Beautiful. Thanks for that. We'll hear the concluding part of that passage later in the conversation. What was your relationship with wine like before you went to France? Were you already something of a wine expert, or was it really that trip to France that got you into wine?
It really was. That trip. I loved wine in the evening as an accompaniment to company or food. I particularly appreciated wine's connection with France, but it was in a much more intellectual way. It was in the way of, attempting to pick out scents above a glass of wine that's swirling beneath your nose, or it was the kind of categorization of the wine world in France, understanding the territory, the geography, the types of grapes, et cetera, that are made into wine in various regions of France. So it was really more a way of knowing France, not so much a way of understanding wine. And so when we got there, we were casual wine enthusiasts, but not really collectors, not particularly knowledgeable, hadn't approached it in any kind of systematic way. And I think to some extent we're intimidated in the way that I think a lot of Americans are intimidated, and maybe quite a few people elsewhere as well, by the kind of exclusivity of some people's approach to wine, where it's a kind of guild. There's a kind of knowingness, almost maybe even contempt for non-wine lovers, and that can make it difficult to find a point of entry into the world of wine. So we arrived really more or less ignorant, enjoyers of wine as an occasional evening ritual, but not knowledgeable at all.
So you really threw yourself in at the deep end
Very
there.
much so.
You had this formative experience, first of all, then as an intern. Then years later, decades later, you decide that you want to take your family to France. What motivated you at that point in your life to move your family to France? And what did you find when you got there? What were the challenges and how did you
We
overcome
so
them?
we when we went in 2012, we had two children. Our son was 9, our daughter was 14. We decided to go because they had actually gone to a French immersion school in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. In part because we were believers in bilingualism generally, but and obviously then if they were going to learn a second language, French made the most sense, because I speak French, and because if we were going to go somewhere, we wanted to go somewhere francophone.
Mm,
So near the end of their elementary school careers, it was clear that they were doing well, that they were absorbing and could sort of understand and write in French, but they weren't quite fluent. And so the idea was, let's go, since my tax preparation career allows me to be more or less available over a fall semester. Let's take the kids to southern France, where it's going to be at least somewhat warm. Let's put them in the local schools. Let's have them cement their language skills, and we'll get a bit of a vacation out of it. They'll get a challenging, potentially life-changing exposure to a foreign country, to living in a foreign country. And we picked the Languedoc simply because of the places in southern France that we could have stayed. Provence and the Riviera and the Alps are just so expensive that we picked the west side of the Rhone because it was simply something that we could afford as a middle class American family. So,
mm,
so it was no more thought out than that. There was a certain randomness or a certain whimsy to our choice of where and when to go. And we certainly did not arrive having any idea that this would become a kind of life changing experience. And we also arrived, I think, with a romanticized version of what Southern France was going to look like and be like. That bubble was immediately punctured when we arrived in this very small, very hot, very blue collar, more or less poor. Languedoc is the second poorest region in France. Little tiny
yeah.
village that was nothing like Princess Grace in a two-seater speeding along the cliffs of Monaco. So
Yeah.
that was, our first impression was sort of, oh my God, what have we done?
Yeah. You soon overcame that first impression.
Really not soon. We got there, and there's a certain, so this is a story of our family's immersion, gradual, hard-won immersion into this village and into the
Yeah.
lives of our neighbors. But it's also really the story, to a great extent, of my overcoming some sort of young man's ego. I arrive knowing that I can speak French well, expecting that this is going to be a not particularly challenging episode. I can speak French. I can help the kids with their French. We can get by. It's going to be sort of a gracious and easy life. And we arrived, as I said, to this place that didn't resemble anything that we were prepared for, into a village that didn't particularly care that they had a group of Americans among them. There were 800 people. It's more like an extended family than like a village. They didn't have any impetus really to go out of their way to try to welcome us. And so there are a couple of early moments in the book, a couple of sort of where I'm delivered an ultimatum where Mary Jo, my wife, who's kind of really the hero of the book, sort of my truth teller, says, "Hey, this isn't working. We can't be extras in the Steve Hoffman show for 6 months. And honestly, if you're going to act this way, I'm not particularly interested in France. We can go anywhere in the world. We don't have to go to France. We're here because of you. And really, you need to make something happen here." Faced with that dilemma of, am I going to get out of my comfort zone, which is uncomfortable to me as an introvert, or am I facing, the end of my relationship with France, which seemed inconceivable to me? I slowly, with lots and lots of failure, try to find the mechanism that is going to allow us to be a part of this village. And cooking is the first idea that I have, but that ends in disaster in quite a few ways. And so by the middle of the book, the grape harvest is beginning. I asked to be part of a grape picking crew, and that is the true turning point, where we switch from being the American family that drops off their kids at school to being peers, co-workers, crewmates. And really, when we stop imposing a vision of what we think this trip ought to be on the place and start asking the questions about what this place truly is and let it speak, it starts speaking voluminously and telling us what it wants us to know, which is this is a part of the world that is based on wine and winemaking and wine's relationship with food in the table. And that's really where we end up by the end of the book.
Yeah, very interesting. Speaking from my personal experience, I've been in Italy now for 13 years, and you really do need to you need to find your community, don't you? You really need to find something that you can hook your personality and your free time, and yeah, find your community. In my case, actually, it was football. It was a local football community, so I find myself
Sure.
playing football and going to the stadium and going to a local bar to watch the football, and then taking my kids to the football, and then they've got involved in grassroots football. So for me, it was football more so than for wine, but it's just so important. I think that you find something that brings you into the community
And I
in that
think
way.
I think it's also a question of attitude, of not just finding your community, but projecting the fact that you're here to be a part of things and that you don't know everything and that you're not looking down on anybody, but are in fact sort of full of wonder and curiosity, and willing to occasionally make a fool of yourself out of a kind of enthusiasm that can look foolish, and understanding that your enthusiasm and foolishness is actually endearing rather than something that people are going to be laughing at or criticizing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. One other person or aspect of your relationship with France that I wanted to ask you about was Richard Olney. Now, I understand he's been a big influence on your career as a food and wine
Yes.
writer. So I wanted just to ask you, who was Richard Olney, and what influence, how has he shaped your understanding of French
I love
cuisine?
this question, and I have not been asked it again often before. So thank you for being perceptive enough to
Mm.
pick up on that. Richard Olney is a personal sort of culinary wine and lifestyle hero of mine. He's an American born in Iowa, so very close to the Minnesota that I grew up in. He was wanted to be an artist, moved to New York eventually. And I should also say, this is in the middle of the 20th century. He was openly gay, which was not an easy thing to be in that era in the United States. So he moved to New
Mm.
York, eventually moved to Paris, and what both painted, but then gradually embarked on this extensive self education in cooking and French, and specifically French cuisine. Eventually, he bought a small mas or farmhouse on a rocky hillside in southern France, in the town of Soliès-Toucasse, which is just north of Toulon. And he settled there for most of the second half of his life. He was such a great cook that he became respected almost as a peer, among some, very good French chefs of the time, but was also a kind of wine savant. He ended up becoming very close to Lucien and Lucie Perrault of Domaine Tempier in Bandol. He also became very close to Aubert de Villaine of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti in Burgundy. He also became very close to the people at Chateau d'Yquem. And he ended up writing two of the definitive books on those two domains, actually, on Yquem and Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. He sort of just lived this life of blended isolation, punctuated with beautifully cooked and shared meals with interesting people. Ended up also writing several cookbooks, one of which, called the French Menu Cookbook, was actually named by the Observer in London as the best cookbook written in the English language. Beautifully lyrical writing, very, very rigorous, intensive research into making sure that all of his recipes were not only reproducible, but were very, very much in line with the great tradition of early in his life, sort of French classical haute cuisine cooking, and later in his life, that sort of beautiful rustic tradition of Provençal cooking. And there's just a kind of rigor and an intellectual curiosity to him, as well as this beautiful lyricism of his writing that intoxicates me every time I open one of his books.
Yeah, absolutely. It really, as you say, intoxicating writer and just a really captivating character as well.
Yes, he does not care if you like him or not.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
cares if you respect him and his food.
yeah. Really, really captivating character. So we'll add some more information about Richard Olney in the show notes because really is someone to you could take a real deep dive into his life and work. Just to go back to the Languedoc, you spoke about being drawn or almost arriving accidentally at the Languedoc, but I think there is something to say for going to these so-called second tier wine regions. There's something about them that makes them much more appealing, I think, as a visitor or as an outsider. The sense that you can get a more authentic experience. You get a warmer reception sometimes because you're showing an interest in a region that is sometimes overlooked. Is that something that you're aware of or something that you would agree with?
Absolutely. I think we could not possibly have had the experience we had in Provence, or certainly in Bordeaux or Burgundy or the Loire or Champagne.
Mm,
The reason that we were able to get so deep here was precisely that this was a slightly undersung region, that the winemakers that we were working with didn't have to worry about crowds showing up every day wanting to taste their wines,
yeah,
and not because they're not well made. They're beautiful expressions of that particular part of the country, but there's just simply not the reputation and the money and the kind of prestige involved in going on a vacation and showing up in Bordeaux. It's a great question, and it's a wonderful way of thinking about travel and experiencing wine when you travel,
yeah,
to consider, going perhaps to a Beaujolais instead of a Burgundy, or considering going to a Languedoc instead of a Châteauneuf-du-Pape. I just think what you're going to learn there, the way that you're going to be accepted, the way that the doors are open for you to come in and show up unannounced and sit down with a winemaker and talk about his or her experience and craft and the way that he or she thinks about winemaking, so much more quickly to a rich experience than trying to find your way through the very touristy, very moneyed parts of the wine world that most people think of when they imagine they're going to go on a trip and sample some wine.
I couldn't agree more. Actually, I mean, I went to Beaujolais, which you mentioned there last year, and it was quite an amazing experience. Precisely for that reason. I mean, for a start, they don't really have any budget. There's no marketing budget. There's no. It's not like when you go to a massive wine fair here or an important wine region here, where you can see there's tours every day and there's marketing and there's festivals. You basically just walk into the Tina and there's no professionality about it. There's no professional tour guide. It just whoever happens to be there will show you around and give you the time of day.
Right.
And we had a
Absolutely.
really fantastic, authentic experience there.
And the other thing that you're getting there is that there's not sort of a layer of bureaucracy between you and the winemaker. There's not the
Mm,
sales floor or the tasting counter where you're having staff members pour you glasses of wine. You actually walk into a winery and you are
yeah,
in direct contact with the winemaker. And I think that's what most people dream about when they think about going somewhere abroad to a wine region and and sampling and trying to learn and trying to experience what it's like to be engaged with wine in that region. But in the most famous parts of the wine world, you're just simply not going to get that. You're going to get a very commercial experience. And in some of these secondary wine regions, you walk into what is essentially a day in the life of a winemaker.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. At what point then did you decide that you wanted to write a book about your experiences? I understand it took you 8 years. So how would you describe that process of writing the book?
Yeah, it really actually took me 10 years to write. So we were there in 2012. My writing was up for that national food writing award. And honestly, it was my wife, Mary Jo, who at some point said, if you're going to go to New York for a food writing award ceremony, you should probably have a book proposal.
Mm,
And I had kept an extensive journal during our time there. It was about 110,000 words. So it was more or less a book already, or a book length, a book's worth of words. And I had never imagined that I would write a book. I grew up loving words, reading voraciously, but more sort of worshiping writers and authors as kind of gods and heroes, not really ever imagining that I could enter that realm.
mm,
This felt sort of almost out of reach to me. And part of the reason that it took 10 years, I think, was in some sense because I was intimidated by the prospect, the idea of entering this sort of holy ground, this holy
mm,
space of writing a book. But also, I really felt that something important had happened during this trip. It was not just an American family goes to France and becomes a part of things. It was that, but it was much more than that. There was a certain middle age stepping into myself, finding myself, stepping into my own authority. And there was also something that beyond the typical, oh, we met these people and they were wonderful and then we went home. By the time we left, we had made true friends with the winemakers and a couple of other people in the village in a way that was life changing, in the sense that we weren't just going to go home and resume our normal lives. These were now people who were integrated into our lives in a way that was unlike any other time we'd been abroad. It took the 10 years in some sense for me, I think, to finally feel I had done justice to that experience, to understand it enough to actually get it into words. And the other reason it took 10 years was honestly just a question of craft. I was sort of very naturally good at writing articles between 1,000 and 2,000 words for magazines and newspapers, but the amount of technique and storytelling ability that was required to write a book of 350 pages, I those required tools that I didn't have. And part of the 10 years, unfortunately, was just a result of this process of learning to write a book and writing a book at the same time. And I could tell I was falling short for quite a few of those years.
mm.
And it took that long for me to, I think, just get good enough to write a book that I felt was worthy of the
Yeah. And
experience.
and what kind of response did you get when you were pitching your book? You mentioned some of the, I suppose, the cliches you could say. So what kind of reaction did you get when you were pitching?
I mean, it was a miserable experience. First of all, the American publishing world is a very opaque, very unfriendly, not particularly accommodating industry to try to break into. Also, what you're talking about is makes it very difficult. You have to boil down an entire life changing experience into a line or two in order to pitch it properly. Everybody wants to be a writer. There are lots and lots of good writers out there, and so how do you stand out? How do you make an impression? And then you can go overboard in that direction by kind of coming up with these sort of silly gimmicks as ways of trying to draw people's attention to your pitch. So the process of trying to get this book in the hands of a publisher, trying to find an agent, was the worst part of the entire, honestly, often frustrating experience. In the end, what turned it around for me was winning that James Beard Award in 2019. That suddenly gave me a legitimacy that I hadn't really possessed before. I'd won several other food writing awards, but the James Beard Awards are um, much more prestigious. They gather much more respect around them, and so actually, it was in New York City, for the award ceremony where I met my editor, Francis Lamb, and he introduced me 15 seconds later to the man who would eventually become my agent. And things started to roll after that. It was a very long slog.
And no shortcuts, I don't
There
suppose.
just aren't. And the other thing I would say is that, I was, of course, angry at the industry for not recognizing my genius without my having to lift a finger over it. In retrospect, the industry was right. For many of those years, the material that I was providing to the people I was pitching was underbaked. It hadn't been in the oven long enough. It was an underconceived story.
Yeah.
I hadn't found what the core was yet. And so, yes, I was frustrated. Yes, I wish it had happened sooner in some sense. But what the process also required me to do was really get to the point where I knew what the story was about so that I could both write it well and talk about it in a way that somebody was going to want to buy it. It's a huge risk right now to buy a book and publish it in a world where people are reading less
Yeah.
and less.
Yeah, for sure. It has to be absolutely pitch perfect, doesn't it? I suppose, and that's a lifetime really to get that. And you write beautifully about the American food scene, particularly in your own local region. You spent time in France. What I want to ask you is, what is your relationship like with Italian food? This is the Italian wine podcast, after all. So what is your relationship like with Italian food and wine? Is that something that you encounter in your local community?
Yeah, it's a great question. Once you get interested in wine, it's hard not to get interested in wines of the world to some extent. And so I do love a number of Italian wines.
Mm.
It's funny because my daughter is obsessed with Italy, with Italian food, Italian wine, and often tells me that she was so disappointed that I had learned French in school because I could have learned Italian, and then we could all be going to Italy together. What I would say is, when you come from the United States, the United States has an interesting relationship with Italian food because there is Italian American food, and it's a little bit of a variation on. It's very much a variation on true Italian food, where some of where pasta and meat and sort of tomatoes and sauce are overemphasized in the United States. And so what I've feel like I'm been in the process of doing recently is unlearning what Italian food meant growing up in the United States.
Yeah.
And understanding the extent to which the Italian food that I respond to the most is primarily the Southern Mediterranean version of Italian food, which I think probably most closely resembles the food I fell in love with in the Languedoc in southern France, which is, a seafood-based, very simple cuisine based on not high technique, but beautiful ingredients simply presented.
Yeah.
But also, I would say that one thing I love about both Italian food and French food compared to being an eater in America is the broad array of foods that people are open to. I think in America we tend to eat a lot of very few ingredients, and it's such a joy to be somewhere where you sit down somewhere near the sea or within smelling distance of the sea and have access to so many different foods that a lot of Americans, I think, would turn their nose up at or be concerned about or not like the shape of or the look of. But for me, as a sort of voracious swashbuckling eater, I just love being in a food culture where the offerings are so wide and where there's just this openness to the joy of food in whatever form it comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a real richness about the food, but also a real naturalness as well. I mean, I was in the supermarket yesterday afternoon with my son, and I mean, in the fruit and veg aisle, you see this diversity.
Absolutely.
But then the other thing that struck me, and it was something I used to hate about Italian supermarkets, you would go into the meat aisle and you could actually smell this raw meat and then the raw fish. At first, I used to be like, oh, that's disgusting, that smell of. But then I'm like, well, I'm surrounded by meat. Of course, it's going to have a smell.
Absolutely.
I think if you go to a supermarket in the UK, that's all been sanitized out of it. So you don't smell anything. You don't smell the natural ingredients or the meat or the fish. that's all been airbrushed out, if you like, so you can have a less intrusive shopping experience.
It's absolutely the same in the United States, where everything is wrapped in plastic, and it smells like a deodorant, but not like food.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I fell in love with as well, both in France and love in Italy. Is there's an embrace of the smelliness of food.
Mm,
Anchovies smell, garlic smells, fish and seafood smell,
yeah.
and I think when you grow up, especially me in a very landlocked part of the United States, the smell of the sea and the smell of seafood can can in our minds have contain a sort of a fishiness that we think is an off flavor.
Mm,
And having spent time near the sea and understanding that strong sea flavor can be a part of very fresh, beautiful food was a kind of wonderful change in my mindset and in my approach to. I don't know how to say this exactly, but it's a big embrace. It's an embrace of food in a much broader context than I think we're allowed to embrace food in the United States right now.
okay, good. Let's go back to that reading, Steve, and do the second part of that extract.
Yeah. Languedoc wines tend to be deeply and darkly fruity because the grapes have a long Mediterranean growing season that lets them reach a level of maturity that other regions with less sunlight can't attain. In general, jammy is not a compliment in the wine world. It's the biggest knock against the style of California wine that Robert Parker made popular, and that became ubiquitous and eventually a bit despised. A big, alcoholic, overripe, understructured wine with a ton of oak. That effect is generated by leaving grapes on the vine very late when they're very sweet, extremely ripe, and have begun to lose acidity. In other words, by intentionally pushing California grapes in the direction of how Mediterranean grapes mature naturally. A good Fougère wine does not reach that level of soft, cloying jamminess. It's picked at peak ripeness, but not past it. It has structure in the form of alcohol and tannin, but it's nevertheless a ripe wine based on fully mature grapes. The winemakers we spent the most time with called that kind of flavor fruit confit, which means cooked fruit. That extremely ripe, dark, luscious quality is vastly more appreciated in southern France than in America, certainly, and to a certain extent even than in the rest of France. Figs are not picked ripe here, but saggy, sticky, half dried, not juicy, but jammy. Prunes are a true delicacy with their own appellation d'origine protégée called pruneau d'Agen, made from a specific variety of plum called the prune dent. For a long time, I could not appreciate this. But what happens when you live here long enough is that you start to adopt the richness, the darkness, and ripeness of Languedoc wine as your baseline wine, your home team, and begin to compare all other wines to Languedoc wines, or more generally to wines of the Midi, which mostly share this quality of what the French wine drinkers call rondeur. Rondeur means roundness, and it's a word you'll hear often when winemakers from this part of the world talk about wine. It's a positive characteristic. It means a kind of corpulence, a generosity. One way to think of it is in the language of shapes, where roundness is the opposite of squareness and sharp corners. But in the specific language of wine, at least in French, rondeur is not the opposite of squareness, but the opposite of tension. A wine can be rond, round, agreeable, full, reassuring, or tendu, tense, vivacious, nervous, fresh. A round wine is structured on alcohol. Alcohol provides the bite that keeps it from being flabby or viscous or flat in the mouth. Also gives round wine something the French refer to often, onctuosité, unctuousness. A tense wine, on the other hand, is structured not on alcohol, but on acidity, a sharp green apple underripeness. And in the end, what we're really talking about, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, are the differences between Southern wines and Northern wines generally. Southern wines tend to be rounder, and Northern wines tend to be more tense, which is simply the result of what sunshine does to grapes when there is more or less of it. But the two words also somewhat wonderfully are a shorthand for the Languedocian view of life itself, lived under the round, relaxed generosity of the Mediterranean sun, in contrast to the anxious, driven neuroticism of northern life. Understanding all this led in my case to one further reordering of my thoughts about wine, and that involved a shift away from thinking about wine as primarily coming from particular regions to thinking instead about wine as primarily coming from particular latitudes. The first sorting I do when I take a sip of wine I'm not familiar with now is not to try to decide whether it was made in Bordeaux or Burgundy or Napa, or more broadly, whether it is French or Italian or Chilean, or even more broadly, whether it is New World or Old World. but whether it is made closer to or farther away from the equator, whether it is, in broadest terms, round and alcoholic or tense and acidic. This evolution of my thinking about wine specifically was part of a larger process of internalizing something I had accepted intellectually before, but never felt quite so deeply, that in a world of increasingly limitless possibilities, some things still can be done in one place on earth that cannot be done in another. And I learned to love our round Languedoc wines, despite their lingering reputation for excessive strength and richness, as one of the things that we could do here that others couldn't. And I began to feel my love for Andre and Thierry's wines as a part of me, part of my identity as someone who had a relationship with this small corner of the world. And in turn, it might be said that I began turning incrementally more round myself and perhaps incrementally less tense.
Very good. It's so deep, there's so much of that that we could just explore and get into in a little bit more detail. I love some of the concepts, and it's really thought provoking way of writing about this wine. This idea of thinking about latitude, about having a benchmark wine that you can use as a kind of barometer.
I think to expand on that a little bit, if we have time, is one of the things that happened during this trip that relates to other parts of our conversation. This idea of being in a place that may be a secondary wine region, or of being in a place long enough to begin to have a relationship with it, or of being open-hearted about your interaction with people and with wherever you happen to be staying. One of the things that this trip did for me that undid some of the kind of, I call it douchiness, but this sort of snobbiness that surrounds a certain part of the wine world, is having that home team, having that one wine or one winemaker or one wine region or one appellation that you get to know and love because you have an emotional relationship with it, because it means something to you, because you love the wines for the wine itself, for the taste and structure of the wine, but also because it has a story that means something to you. Getting very knowledgeable about this little Fougère appellation in the Languedoc region of southern France gave me a sort of authority where I knew what I needed to know about that wine. I knew that I loved it for reasons that I was comfortable with. And that really has translated into a feeling of comfort with engaging with wine more broadly, because I feel as if I have a footing in the world that I can trust and that means something important to me, and that I don't need to know everything about every other region in the world. I don't need to become an expert on vintages and the good and bad years of great houses of French and Italian wine. I have my territory, I have my turf that I feel comfortable on, and I'm happy to engage with people who have knowledge in other parts of the wine world. But I don't feel
Mm.
inferior anymore in a way that I feel like I did before I had
Yeah,
this experience.
absolutely. And that idea of this deep immersive experience, and even deep immersive traveling or deep immersive wine appreciation is one that I really took away from your writing. The benefits of going back to the same place time after time is something I constantly battle with my wife with. I always say, well, let's just go back to the same place. We had a great time. And she's always like, no, I want to go and try somewhere new. Whereas I think I'm really coming around to the idea of, yeah, just go back to the same place. If it's went well and if you've enjoyed it and it's ticking your boxes, then go for that full immersion.
And I think what you're getting by staying in one place, even though it can feel restrictive and feel as if you're limiting yourself, is at some point what you're achieving by doing that is what everybody who's chasing all over the world trying to have a travel experience is actually after. It's just that they haven't yet had the opportunity to be somewhere long enough where they actually establish the kinds of relationships that I think you dream about when you're planning your 2 week trip,
Mm,
to Sicily. You imagine that you're going to end those 2 weeks in a relationship with that place and with relationships to people that are going to be rich and that you get to take home with you. And the problem is that 2 weeks
mm,
or even a month, or in some cases even several months, just isn't enough time. And so I really agree with what you're saying. I really feel strongly that in a world of limitless availability of travel and cheap options of getting almost anywhere in the world, it's no longer that interesting to have gone to a lot of places and seen them for a short time, because
mm.
everybody else has done that now. what people aren't doing, and what is the more difficult but more rewarding experience, is to stay in one place, to stay put for long enough to start really understanding a place, and I think that brings actually the kind of richness that most people are looking for, who are missing it by jumping from one place to another and not
Yeah,
settling in for a
absolutely.
while.
Just a couple of quick questions then, just to bring things to a close and conscious of time.
Mm-hmm.
What are you currently reading for pleasure? What's on your bedside table?
Oh, great question. I'm currently reading. I just finished actually Sally Rooney's most recent novel called Intermezzo, and I am reading. I'm actually I've been trying to. I'm a huge P.G. Woodhouse fan. I don't know if you're familiar with P.G. Woodhouse. There's a lot of humor in my book. I really like writing that humor, and I would like to include humor in the next book that I write. And so I've been trying to find who's going to be my next favorite kind of humorous author, and I keep striking out. So I keep coming back to P.G. Woodhouse. is what I'm saying. I just don't think anybody has ever made me laugh so consistently through the course of a book than Woodhouse. He's just a very strange genius, but the characters of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves are just eternally satisfying and rewarding for me.
Excellent, excellent. We'll put links to those books and indeed to PG Woodhouse in the show notes as well. I'm at a point where I'm moving house this year, so I'm trying not to buy any new books. What I am doing is packing up my old books, putting them in boxes so they're ready
Yeah.
for the move. So I'm kind of deciding which ones to take with me and which ones not. I came across just this week a book that I read when I was much younger, which is The Red Dragon by Thomas Harris.
Oh yeah.
Is the prequel to Silence of the Lambs,
Right.
one that gets the whole Hannibal Lecter thing off the ground. And I remember reading it as a as a teenager, and being absolutely terrified by it. Also finding it utterly compelling. It's so well written.
Yes.
So I've started to read that again this week, and I have to say I'm really enjoying it. He just has a lovely way of capturing a sense of place. He brings in astronomy and the stars, what the stars are doing, and what the weather's doing. Yeah, I just really love, despite the kind of horrific events that he's
Right.
describing
Right.
about. There are these
Exactly.
really beautiful moments of, I don't even know how you describe it, just beautiful passages that, or sentences, even barely even sentences. Sometimes just something that gives you a sense of place. So yeah, that's what I've got on my bedside
By
table.
the way, one other thing I realize I'm reading right now, just began, that I can highly recommend, is a new wine book from 2024 that was also, I think, on Tam Curran's list. It's called A Thousand Vines by Pascaline Pelletier.
Mhm.
And it's just kind of a thorough reevaluation of wine, from almost a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah.
She's a beautiful writer and has just thought so deeply and beautifully about wine. I'm really enjoying
Yeah,
that book as well.
absolutely. What's next for you, Steve? What can we expect? Do you have something else book in progress, or are you waiting for your next piece of inspiration?
Well, as it's late January, so what's next in my life is tax season. So I have several months ahead of me of my head buried in my computer with trying to finish clients' tax returns in a reasonable amount of time. But yes, there's another book. This experience was transformative to me in the sense that I was a food writer, and now I consider myself a writer, an author, and that some of those storytelling techniques that I taught myself have me excited to write more books. So I plan to write another book. I don't know what it's going to be about yet. I'm fascinated by several topics that are both in and out of the sort of France food and wine world, and that's what I'll be taking up in probably April as tax season winds down. I will be, choosing which of these topics is going to be worthy of, probably spending a year or two completely immersed in it again. But yes, that's my next project, is writing my next book.
Okay. What about a book on the secret life of a tax preparer? Is there any audience for that?
You know what? Honestly, that is probably the most likely option. As funny as that sounds,
Mm.
and the idea behind it, if I do write about it, is that you think of a tax office as a place with a very straight, linear thinking guy who's probably not in very good shape, who is immersed in numbers, and that's it. And in fact, at least the way the American system works, for me as a tax preparer to be able to do my clients' returns properly, I actually need to know almost everything about them. I need to know about as much about them as often their doctors know.
Absolutely.
And so I need to know, if they're generous charitable givers. I need to know how much money they made. I need to know if they, got a job or lost a job last year, whether they had a child, whether somebody got sick. And so there's this remarkable intimacy actually in the tax office, and quite a few really beautiful sort of human stories that evolve out of these relationships that happen over years and years. So I'd really like to write about that kind of unexpected duality between the very linear numbers based aspect of my career and this need to be in deep relationships with 500 human beings and their families every year over and over.
I can see it for sure. Okay, where can we follow you, Steve? And more importantly, where can we get a copy of your book?
Yeah, so in Europe, unfortunately, you're probably stuck with Amazon. I know not everybody loves Amazon, but it is on Amazon, I think available almost anywhere in Europe. And you can reach me or follow me or get in touch with me on Instagram. Is probably the place I'm most active. And my handle there is at SJR Hoffman. So that's Stephen John Raymond Hoffman. My website, where you can find a lot of my other writing outside of the book itself, is also just www.sjrhoffman.com. And I'm always open to communication. So if you want to direct message me, or you'll be able to find my email on my website. If you want to contact me or have any questions about the book or about anything else, I'm very open to that. I love to communicate with people. So please feel free to check in with me.
And we'll put links to those websites and the Instagram feed on our show notes. I can highly recommend your website. Your body of writing is really, really great fun to read. I took a deep dive into that before Christmas when I was preparing for this show, and the writing really is wonderful. So many congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I like to keep things light. So just to reassure people, I'm not taking myself too seriously. There's a lot of humor there too.
Absolutely. So Steve, thanks once again for your company today. I think I could probably have thrown another dozen or so questions at you. Could have spoke for another hour, but
I was just thinking the same thing. We could talk after that passage for another hour at least.
Yeah. Next month we're talking to Susan Keevil, and her book is on Tuscany. So keep an eye out for that coming next month. Until then, thanks for listening. Ciao. Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get them.